Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. I do appreciate you being with me. Hey, I appreciate the wonderful comments. I hope you're enjoying this series, this study. You know, somebody told me the other day that they hope that I just I do 600 videos in this series. Well, I'm not going to try to do that, okay? But I do want to provide sufficient evidence, sufficient proof to show the intertextuality of Matthew 25, of the Olivet Discourse, with the entire corpus of the Old Testament prophetic body. You know, I was raised in an environment, I was raised in a religious and theological context in which it was said the law of Moses, the Old Covenant, was nailed to the cross. And beginning on the day of Pentecost, God started all over with the church. And from Pentecost forward, it has nothing to do with the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. In numerous formal public debates with men from that background, I have asked them, are your eschatological promises based upon an anticipation of the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? And they have said, no. God was through with Israel at the cross. God nailed the law to the cross. Well, if that's true, then how could it be that the New Testament writers, in their doctrine of the wedding of Christ, allude to, quote, from the Old Covenant promises God made to Old Covenant Israel about remarrying her in the last days? You see, one of the underlying fallacies here is that in that fellowship from which I came, it is believed that the last days of the Christian age, okay? Ostensibly, God has nothing to do with Old Covenant Israel in the last days. And yet, the Old Covenant prophecies are that in the last days, God would remarry Israel. You see the problem? This is a huge conundrum. So, let me reiterate the statement that I made yesterday. If it is the case that Matthew 25, the coming of the Lord at the time of the wedding, is the coming of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 49, which is the restoration of Israel, not national restoration, not kingdom restoration. No, Israel being raised from the dead, transformed into the incorruptible body of Christ. If Matthew 25 and the coming of the Lord is Isaiah 49, and if we determine when Isaiah 49 was to be fulfilled, then we can determine without any doubt whatsoever when the coming of the Lord of Matthew 25 would be fulfilled. We established yesterday from Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, that Isaiah 49, the time for the fulfillment had arrived in the first century. That means the time for the coming of the Lord of Matthew 25 and the wedding had arrived in the first century. Now let's drive this home even more by going back to Isaiah 49 and looking at the language. Now, by the way, let me remind you once again, because this is so critical. In Isaiah 49:9, the Lord made the promise that in the acceptable time, in the day of salvation, they will say to the prisoners, go forth. To those who are in darkness, show yourself. Folks, this is absolutely nothing but the promise of resurrection. Darkness was death. It was a symbol, a figure for death. Just like Hosea foretold that God was going to kill the 10 northern tribes. He was going to destroy the kingdom. Not the family, the kingdom, according to Amos chapter 9, verse 9. So don't don't forget that we are dealing with the very same things as Hosea. We're dealing with the departure of the Lord, the divorcement of Israel, and the death of Israel, but the promise of the return of the Lord, the remarriage of the Lord, the resurrection of Israel. And by the way, it's amazing to me how many scholars see that the resurrection in Hebraic thought was nothing other than or nothing less than the restoration of Israel. Brent Petrie does a fantastic job of that in his book. I've got it right here somewhere. Always got it close. It's right there. In his book, Jesus, the Tribulation, and the End of Exile. In Bouvy, in his book, Peter and the Tribulation. I believe that's the name of it. If you want the name of it, contact me. These scholars and more, Richard Hayes and others, recognize that on one level, the restoration of Israel under the Messiah is resurrection. It's not the raising of biological bodies out of the grave. It is the raising of Israel out of alienation from God, out of sin, death, just as Hosea 13, 1 and 2 describes. But I'm getting sidetracked here, so I've got to move on. Notice in this day of salvation, in which Israel would be brought out of the darkness into the light. Verse 9 continues, they shall feed along the roads, their pasture shall be on all desolate heights. They shall neither hunger nor thirst, neither heat nor sun shall strike them. For the one who has mercy on them will lead them, even by the springs of water. He will guide them. Okay. What a beautiful picture. Now, by the way, let me point out that writing over 200 years later, Ezekiel, who is dealing primarily with the two southern tribes that were facing destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, he looks beyond that to the time of the restoration of all 12 tribes, Ezekiel chapter 37, which is the time of what? Of what? The return of the Lord, the remarriage of Israel, the resurrection. And he envisions that time, and he says in Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 29 and following, that would be the time. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the time of the restoration of Israel, which is the time of the remarriage of Israel. At that time, there will no longer hunger or thirst. I will be their God. They shall be my people. Now, is he talking about literal physical hungering and thirsting? Probably not. But here's what I want you to see. Notice that he says, I will have mercy on them and I will lead them, even by the springs of water, he will guide them. Do you realize, folks, that in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 14, John quotes this verse to speak of the righteous remnant of the 12 tribes of Israel, as well as the great multitude that no man could number. Now, he's focused on the 12 tribes, no doubt, and he says he will lead them to the river of life, to the springs of life. Well, when was that going to take place? Oh, it would take place at the time of the wedding. Revelation 19:6. But when would the wedding of Revelation 19:6, the time in which Israel would be led by the river of life, and a great multitude that no man could ever number would also be invited to join them to participate in the river of life. When would that be? Oh, it would be at the destruction, the death of Babylon, the city where the Lord was crucified. You have any doubt where that is? So here, once again, just like Paul did in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, John in Revelation draws directly from Isaiah 49, and he applies it to his day and the imminent, coming soon, at hand, shortly to come to pass, destruction of old covenant Jerusalem. The death of the adulterous wife, Judah. In the time of the remarriage, the reconstitution, the resurrection. Yeah, it's all related. Now, we've got more from Isaiah 49. I'm out of time today. Don't forget, get yourself a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. Make mention of the fact you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. I'll refund your shipping, saving you almost $5. Okay? Out of time. Gotta go. I'll see you on the flip side.